Good morning, Mark Conlock here, Director of Horticulture at Green Bay Botanical Garden. Here to share with you some tips about insects and diseases now that we're getting a little further on, middle to mid-late growing season, so we start to see some insects and diseases. Wanted to just mention some general things about it as we go through here. So over here on this zinnia, this is our All-America Selection Trial Garden, by the way, where we're trialing plants for All-America Selection. So we have an entry plant and then the comparisons, and we're seeing if they live up to the breeder claims and if they're better plants to put out on the market. So one of the ones here, the zinnia, you can see it has a lot of an insect on it. And a lot of you all probably know what that is from your own gardens. It's the Japanese beetle. So one of the first things though, before you attack the insects on your plants, you should really know what they are. So, a good way to do that is to a certain plant, and I always like to put UW extension in my search to get some good research-based information, and usually that'll narrow it down. If you can't figure it out, the UW extension has their horticulture help desk, and they have, a website or an address, email address here to send information to, or a phone number to call for Brown County UW extension, or if you're in a different county, that particular extension agent's office. That's a great place because they get a lot of the same calls, same questions, so they know what to do and what's out there. So these Japanese beetles, one of the first things we like to do here at the garden is, instead of spraying chemicals, is to just try to knock them into soapy water, or you could even squish them with your fingers. The Japanese beetles are pretty easy to do that when they're not really active, when it's a cooler part of the day, and then they just will kind of drown in the soapy water. We also do it to Colorado potato beetles and other insect infestations, and it's really, it really works well if you have a small amount of that pest and kind of scout all the time. So that's another important thing to do in your garden, is to just scout for these pests always when you're weeding, watering, and doing stuff. Kind of look around and see what you see, learn what it is so you can control it. We just use, dish soap in our buckets here. Our ice cream pails work really well to carry around. They're not too heavy. If you do want to or need to use something, we like to look at more biological or benign controls first. So the BT is something you can use on certain types of caterpillar larvae, but remember, it still does have a caution label on the product. So you have to always, on all these insecticides and pesticides and herbicides and all sides of all kinds, read the label, follow those instructions. It has to be labeled for the plant that you're applying it to and the pest that you're going after. So make sure that you look at that in the store before you buy it, and that it's applicable for what you're doing. Even a thing like a wasp and hornet killer, it does have that caution label on there. So be careful with all that stuff, because those things are, are dangerous if used wrong. Another thing you start to see this time of the year are different diseases. So there's something called the disease triangle. That's having a susceptible host, having the pathogen, and then having the right environmental conditions. So you need to have all three of those things to have a disease occur on your plants. And you can see on these sunflowers, we're starting to get some diseases here, some leaf spots, so some fungal diseases, some bacterial diseases perhaps. So one of the things you can do is prune off some of those really bad diseased leaves so that you remove the pathogen, so it's less likely to splatter up and around everywhere. And that's why cleaning up your garden at the end of the season, especially diseased foliage, is very important, to compost it in a pile that gets hot enough to kill it, which is hard to do, or to bury it, burn it, or bag it up in the garbage and throw it away, so you don't have that pathogen coming back from year to year to year. The other thing is the right environmental conditions. So this trial, we kind of always run out of space, so we have to put stuff a little closer. But what we could do is space these sunflowers out further, or say your garden phlox or things, so that you get airflow so the leaves dry, because a lot of times these diseases form when you have humid conditions. So another thing to think about is when you're watering, don't just water wholesale over the top and get the leaves all wet, and then sometimes it takes them longer to dry out, especially if you're watering later in the day. It's better to water early so you have all day for it to dry out. And when you water, have your watering wand or your hose spray down to the soil. That's where plants take up water, through the roots anyway, and then you're less likely to have disease set up in your garden that way. Other thing that you're starting to see out here is powdery and downy mildews. So this is a piece of a phlox from our crust oval garden where you can see what it starts to look like. And then as it progresses, it gets worse, and then pretty soon, you know, it can be dead like this. So one of the things with phlox is they're pretty susceptible to this, so the spacing of the plants to get that airflow is important, and also looking at newer cultivars on the market that are less prone to get powdery mildew is another important thing to do. We'll see another example of that down in a second. Also wanted to quick show you, this is our American Rose Trial for Sustainability garden plots here. We have 3 different replicated blocks where we trial these roses. So we look at things like insect resistance, disease resistance, amount of flowering, self-cleaning, so that again you start with a plant that's less or not susceptible to those diseases and insects, so you don't have to do all this work. So isn't that the perfect way to go? Start out with the right plant that isn't going to get those things. So when they walk through and look here, you can see a lot of these guys are pretty clean. You see a couple holes in some where an insect is eating, but then you see on this particular one that it's starting to get the black spot fungal disease. So that will show up in the trialing results where, you know, it depends if it's in all of these different replicated blocks or not. But what we do here is the few hybrid teas require, you know, care, do have to get a fungicide regimen. So again, you have to read the directions and follow everything that goes through there. But the thing with the different fungicides is you often have to spray them every 7 to 10 days. So that gets to be a lot of extra work, you know, for gardeners to have to do. So the whole idea of this trial is if we see ones that don't have it, it reduces the work required to take care of them, but it also reduces the amount of chemicals that are being used and the exposure of, you know, workers and everybody else. So that's a good thing, to not have to do all that stuff. Couple final ideas for you. Remember to do your weeding, because a lot of times when you read the books and learn about weeds, what you find is that new succulent growth is where insects like to hang out on and reproduce on, and also where diseases can set up. So in essence, it becomes a sink for insects and diseases to then attack your garden plants. So if you can get rid of these weeds, you again get rid of the pathogen or the insect, so it won't be that part of that disease triangle, or it won't be an insect that's going to eat your plants. And again, just to reiterate the whole idea of starting with the right plant, in our Schneider terrace garden up above, we have a lot of Rudbeckia goldsturm. And now these are a couple leaves I just pulled off, and you can see it has this fungal disease on it, this black spotting. And these leaves will just get like that every year because this particular plant is susceptible to that. And you can see this is part of our bud burst trial, where we're going to look at the amount of different native insects that go on the different cultivars and straight species of aster, Rudbeckia, and columbine. We have to do some weeding here to get those insects and diseases away, but you can see how the goldsturm that we just got and planted already has some of that, you know, disease, because it's just susceptible to it, and it probably came like that. And some of these other ones here, like little gold star, has it too. But this one over here, Summer Blaze, and a leaf I took from American Gold Rush, you know, those guys don't have that disease because they're not susceptible for it. So when you're looking at garden plants to add, think about the ones that aren't susceptible, or what we ought to do maybe is get rid of the goldsturm and replace it one that isn't susceptible, so that we have a nice, great looking garden all the time. So those are just a couple ideas about the disease triangle, about scouting for insects and making sure you're treating it and kind of working your way up with the IPM steps so that you don't have to use chemicals at all, hopefully. Check out the UW Extension in Brown County for more information about insects, diseases. Take advantage of their horticultural helpline. And also check out our website, www.gbvg.org, or in our Facebook page for other ideas and tips.